Hi everybody! Today I wanted to spend some time talking about some interview tips for all of you who are applying and about to interview for medical school or for residency applications, basically your next step in your medical career. Right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of you and hopefully all of you will be interviewing in a virtual setting online, but that I'm going to save for a second video. Instead today, I wanted to focus on generic interview tips because I'd like to make a video that is applicable in the future even when this pandemic is just a part of our memory. So let's get started. Tip number 1, know your application. It's important for you to know what you wrote in your application from front to back, start to finish. Basically, anything that you wrote on your application is fair game for your interviewer to ask you about. That means that if you wrote about some small research experience that maybe you had 4 years ago in a lab where you worked only for 1 month, you still need to be able to talk about that research experience and what you learned from that experience as if it happened yesterday. Make sure you go back and review your written application so that you can remember everything that you put down there. The next tip is kind of an obvious one, but tip number 2, know where you're interviewing. If you're interviewing for a school, for example, in the Midwest, then it probably makes sense to talk about the Midwest and why you would be excited to go to the Midwest. Know the geography, know the strengths, know the quirks about the institution that you're going to, because it's important for you to give off a sense that you're excited about going to that particular place. Sometimes they'll ask you, why do you want to come here specifically? And this is a great time to pull on all that knowledge that you already have about what made you excited about that program in the first place. Doing a little bit of homework beforehand so that you know some specifics is really helpful here, and it will pay dividends as long as you can use those facts that you've learned in your interview. Tip number 3, be ready to answer the question, why medicine? Let's say you're applying to medical school. It's important that you know how to answer the question, why do you want to be a doctor? Or why did you decide to go into medicine? This is a basic question that hopefully you've already thought about before you decided to apply for medical school, but certainly one that's very telling. Make sure you have an answer ready to go for that question.
If, however, you're applying for residency, I find that this type of question is a lot less common. By the time you've been invited for interviews, your commitment to that specialty has already shown through in your application, and generally people aren't double checking during your interview.
This leads into tip number 4, which is practice. Make sure that you're ready for those questions and that you've actually practiced your answers. However, you don't want to over practice. You still want to sound spontaneous, but you just don't want to be fumbling around for ideas. So make sure that you've practiced enough so that you know what concepts and ideas you want to get across, but that you haven't rehearsed it to a point that you sound like a robot. Tip number 5, let the interviewer drive the interview. Your interviewer probably has a list of questions that they want to get through. Yes, they'll let the interview go in whichever direction you steer the conversation. But at the same time, you want to give some control to the interviewer so that he or she can definitely get the important questions answered. Things that they clearly think are important to get answered in order to make a determination of how good of a fit you are for their institution, their program, whatever you're interviewing for. That also ties in with tip number 6, which is to be concise. You don't want to ramble on forever about a lot of these questions. So for example, a lot of interviews start with a question or a statement, tell me about yourself. I actually ask this to our applicants when we do mock interviews quite frequently, and I think it's very interesting because some people will use the tell me about yourself question and launch into a 10 or 15-minute discussion about why they went into medicine or why they went into their particular specialty. I think it's probably better to have a more concise answer, 2 to 3 minutes maximum, maybe even less than that, and then let the interviewer ask you those follow-up questions. I think of the tell me about yourself question or a lot of these open-ended questions as a way for you to really drop some hints and to steer the interview in a particular direction, especially if you can bring up past experiences or ideas that's going to pique the interviewer's interest so that he or she may decide to ask you more about it. Tip number 7, don't be controversial. And I don't mean by what you say, I just mean by standing out in a way that's unnecessary. So when we used to interview in person, I always used to tell my mentees, this is not the time to wear a bright pink suit. This is the time to wear black, dark blue, something that's not going to make you stand out because all of a sudden you'll be that applicant who wore the bright red suit if you're not careful. And so while, yes, you do want to stand up for your answers, you want to stand up for the type of applicant that you are, fashion is not necessarily the way to do it. I think this is a perfect example of where dressing like everyone else is perfectly reasonable and to let your answers and your application do the talking for you. Tip number 8, remember the circumstances in which you're interviewing. right now, in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the middle of an election year in which diversity issues have really come to the forefront of our nation's conversation, I think it's important to realize that you may very well get questions that are related to those. Those are tough questions, and those are also really hard questions for interviewers to ask. If I were interviewing someone, I probably wouldn't ask those questions because they can get a little bit controversial and they can get a little bit risky. But that said, that doesn't mean that every interviewer will feel that way. I still think it's good to think about those questions and the potential message that you want to send because it's been on everyone's mind and it's all been very pertinent to the medical field. Be ready to address questions related to diversity, COVID-19, and politics. Now that said, the other piece of the advice that I would give is be true to yourself. You don't want to go to an institution where you're not going to be welcome for how you feel, for the ideas that you have, and any good institution, any good program is going to be welcoming of everyone's ideas and is going to be very inclusive. And so for that reason, I don't think you need to hide who you are per se, but at the same time, be ready with an answer so you're not blindsided by that type of question. Tip number 9, have 2 questions ready to go. You and I both know that at the end of your interview, the interviewer will usually ask, what questions do you have for me? And it's always nice to have 2 questions ready to go. I generally will try to save 2 questions that I know I can rely on. But a couple of things I would suggest. One is that if you can think of a more pertinent question to the conversation that you just had, definitely use that question instead. One great suggestion is to actually look at the office in which you're sitting. Or if you're on a Zoom call, to actually look at the background. So for example, if you look at my background here, you might pick out a book title over here or try to figure out what these photos are. Something that might relate to that interviewer personally is a great way to start a conversation. Also think about some generic questions that you could ask almost any interviewer. So for example, one question I like to ask if I'm at a loss for other questions is, what brought you to this institution in the first place and what keeps you here? Or what is one thing that you would change about this program? I would caution you against asking any questions where the answer is easily looked up on the website or in a catalog. Basically, if it's an answer that you could have figured out on your own, I'd probably avoid asking those. And so this is a great time to think about some pseudo-personal questions that you could ask your interviewer, like the one I suggested. All right, tip number 10, and my last tip for all of you. Be on your best behavior. Especially when you're interviewing in person, every single person that you come into contact with at that institution is watching you. Even though the people that you're interacting with may not sit on the admissions committee, you know that those people are talking to the admissions committee and probably knows the admissions committee a lot better than you do. So if you're mean to a secretary or if you're short with a custodial staff member, that can get back to the admissions committee and not bode well for you. One of the things that we love seeing was applicants chatting with each other and sharing Ubers and Lyfts to the airport and just in general getting along with each other. Because as an admissions committee member, what that tells me is that the person I'm interviewing can get along with other people, especially potential colleagues in the future. So just realize that when you're interviewing, everyone's kind of watching not only what you say, but what you do. One thing that I also tell my mentees when they're about to go out for interviews is just to be on your best behavior from when you leave your house to when you come back home. Because you don't know if you're going to be sitting on a plane next to someone that ends up interviewing you, or if you're going to end up sharing an Uber pool with someone else who happens to be influential. And so for that reason, just always be careful. This also ties in a little bit with the second part of the tip, which is once the interview's over and you get back home, let it go. Don't sweat the small stuff. Maybe you forgot something that you wanted to say, or maybe you answered something in a not great way. It's okay to move on. I guarantee you that the interviewer and the committee has moved on already. So there's no point for you to dwell on whatever answer you gave or whatever thing you did. It's time to focus on the next interview. Those are my general interview tips as you start to look at potential programs for residency or for medical school or even fellowship. But I think that these tips do apply for all levels of medical training. If you found this video to be helpful, please like below. And if you think that this information is stuff that you're interested in, please consider subscribing to the channel. And my plan is to create another video specifically with tips on how to ace your virtual interviews. So take a look there, it'll be coming soon. See you later.